want to thank, I don't know if I should say Dr. Clausen or Rabbi Clausen, Dr. Rabbi, for welcoming me here. We were classmates actually at the Jewish Theological Seminary back in the day, so it's really lovely now that we're both in our professional places to be able to see each other in professional roles. And I want to thank, I'm not going to remember all the co-sponsors, but the Religious Studies Department and the Hillel and all of the families who sponsored this and anybody else who made it possible. So thank you. I just returned just about a week ago from Immokalee, Florida, which is a little area about 45 minutes inland from Fort Myers, if you know that area. Immokalee is the place that is, the reason that you might know it at all, or the reason it affects us, is because it's where most of our tomatoes come from, at least during the winter. It's the area that supplies most of the tomatoes, certainly for the East Coast and really for much of America. I was down there with a group of rabbis. This is the third time that I've been down there with a group of rabbis over the past year. So I want to talk a little bit about what's going on with tomato pickers in Immokalee, and I want to talk about what a group of rabbis was doing down there, hanging out in the tomato fields with tomato pickers for the third time. And I'm going to talk about that also by talking about what I think that Judaism can bring to contemporary discussions of morality, contemporary moral issues, contemporary human rights issues, and contemporary justice issues. So first, tomatoes. This is what's going on in the tomato fields. The tomato fields in Florida have been called ground zero for human trafficking and modern-day slavery by a US attorney who's been working on breaking up slavery cases down there. It's significant that this year we're celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, and yet, unfortunately, 150 years after slavery was legally outlawed in the United States, there's still slavery here. Now, we don't exactly know how many slaves. I've heard estimates ranging anywhere from 15,000 to 200,000. So that's a very big range, which says that we just don't know how many people. But the best estimates about the Florida agricultural industry are that 5 to 10% of agricultural workers are in slavery. And what I mean by slavery is usually what happens is that somebody who may or may not be in this country legally, maybe they have what's called an H-2A visa, which is an agricultural worker visa, maybe they have no visa at all, or maybe they're actually even an American citizen who's just down on their luck. Maybe they're somebody who's born here, now is homeless, very vulnerable. So one of these people pays or promises someone a huge amount of money to get a great job. And now they're in debt. And now this person takes them and owns them effectively, or maybe even sells them to somebody else. And now this person, who's now owes a large amount of money to somebody, needs to work to pay off the debt. Now, they're never going to get out of this debt, because not only are they working at a very, very low-wage job to pay off the debt, they also now owe money for transportation, for their food, for their housing, et cetera, et cetera. And they can't escape, they can't leave, first of all because whoever's holding them as a slave is probably holding onto their passports and visas, so if they leave, they have no documents to show that they're allowed to be here or to allow them to travel. And also because usually whoever's holding them is monitoring them day in and day out, and also because they know that if they don't pay back their debt, probably something very, very bad is going to happen to their family in their home country. So that's the worst of what happens in Florida. And like I said, about 5 to 10% of agricultural workers are in this situation. Historically, it's been mostly in the tomato fields, though also in other industries. And I'll talk about that more in a second. So that's a worst case scenario. The best case scenario, which is the other 90 to 95% of people, has been that they're getting paid by the pound for tomatoes, not by minimum wage, which means that in order to earn minimum wage on a typical day, they have to pick something like 2.5 tons of tomatoes, which might be possible during certain parts of the season if you're very fast, if it's the first pick, when there's lots and lots of tomatoes on the vines. But by the time you get around to the second pick, the third pick, there's not so many tomatoes, it's not actually possible. So they're being paid by the pound, not by the hour. They're working with pesticides, some of which are banned in 49 states. except for Florida, of course. Pesticides that cause chemical burns, certainly, that cause birth defects if pregnant women are handling them, and there's some evidence that they'll cause cancer down the line. There's rampant sexual harassment and assault. Every single woman has a story of sexual harassment, to the point that there was a study that came out this past year about sexual harassment in the agricultural industry, and one of the women was quoted as saying, "It's so common, I thought it was part of the job." To work in an industry where you think that being sexually assaulted is just part of your job. So the good news is that over the past 15 years, a group of amazing, amazing tomato workers have come together. They've formed an organization called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, or CIW for short. And they first tried going to the growers, and they said to the growers, "We want you to sign a code of conduct. No slavery, no sexual assault, minimum wage protection, safety protections." Of course, the growers said no. So then they said, okay, well, let's look at who buys these tomatoes. And a number of years ago, they staged a several-year boycott of Taco Bell. They got people around the country, including, I would say, this was incredibly, incredibly part of this movement, was that students on college campuses were going to their colleges and saying, "We don't want Taco Bell in our food court," and closing down Taco Bell, not eating there. And eventually, after, I think, 3 years, Taco Bell said, okay, we're only going to buy tomatoes from companies that agree to a certain set of standards. Now, Taco Bell buys a lot of tomatoes. And when they go to a grower and say, here are the standards, well, the grower is going to have to clean up their act, because otherwise they can't sell to Taco Bell, and that's a lot of tomatoes. So then CIW went for the rest of the fast food industry. They got McDonald's and Subway and Burger King, and most recently in the last few weeks, Chipotle, to sign on to this campaign. So they're growing a market of people who say, of companies, huge companies that say, we're only buying tomatoes if they come from a farm where there's no slavery, where there's no sexual assault, and where the workers are paid minimum wage. And then the organization started going after the grocery stores. And this is where Rabbis for Human Rights North America came in. We came down for the first time last September, and we heard that where they were with the grocery stores was that Whole Foods had signed on, without a fight, they just signed on. And they were in the middle of a huge fight with Trader Joe's. And we said, okay, Trader Joe's, that's a pretty important grocery store in the Jewish community. They carry a lot of kosher foods. They tend to be in urban, suburban areas with large Jewish populations. We can organize rabbis in Jewish communities to go to Trader Joe's and say, we want you to buy better tomatoes. And we did. We had rabbis all over the country going themselves to their local Trader Joe's. We had them bringing their students, their Hebrew school kids. We had them bringing their congregants. We had one rabbi pass out 2,000 postcards during Yom Kippur services to his congregation to send to Trader Joe's. We had rabbis speaking at protests. We brought a group of rabbis along with a group of ministers to the Trader Joe's headquarters in Orange County, California. And they didn't get in. They had a letter signed by rabbis, signed by ministers. They didn't get in. Nobody came out to take their letter to say, thank you so much, we'll take you under consideration, which is normally what happens, which led the Atlantic magazine to then run a headline that said, Trader Joe's locks its doors to rabbis and ministers, which I think was not a message approved by the Trader Joe's PR department. And then last February, there was a weekend when there were going to be protests at about 40 Trader Joe's around the country. We had rabbis speaking at many of them. So the protests were going to be going from Friday through Sunday. And Thursday afternoon, we got a call from CIW, and they said to us, Trader Joe's just called us, they're signing. And they did, which shows the power of rabbis, ministers, and really ordinary people who shop at a store to say, we want you to buy better tomatoes. The company eventually listens. So a few things have happened in the meantime. One major thing that's happened is that since then, actually 90% of the growers have decided that they're going to sign on to a code of conduct, which means that 90% of the growers in Florida have said that they are going to wipe out slavery in their fields, they're going to wipe out sexual harassment, zero tolerance policy for sexual harassment assault. Somebody is, if there's an inspection, it turns out that somebody's guilty, they're fired, that's it. There's minimum wage, they'll agree to minimum wage protections. They agree that the workers have to be on the payroll. This was something that was happening before where the workers wouldn't be on the payroll, their crew leaders would get paid, and then it was up to the crew leaders to distribute money to the workers. You can imagine how well that worked. So 90% of the growers have signed on to this, which is amazing. But the problem isn't actually over. Because for most of these growers, there are a few who have done this ideologically and really believe in it and really want to have an ethical company. That's about 1, maybe 2 companies. Most of them, if they find a market for tomatoes that aren't grown under these conditions, they'll go right back. So the campaign right now is to put pressure on other retailers to say that they're also only going to buy from companies that have a certain set of policies, specifically in the grocery industry. And the other thing that's important about the retailers is that part of the deal is the retailers agree to pay a penny more a pound for tomatoes, and that penny gets passed on directly to the workers. Nothing's taken off. Which means that when the worker gets their pay stub, which now they actually get a pay stub because they're actually on the payroll, it will say, here you worked this many hours, and you'll either get the higher of either minimum wage or the pounds picked, so it'll say how many pounds picked, how many, or minimum wage, and then it'll say pounds picked for McDonald's. It'll have the name of the company on there. Let's say 100 pounds times 1 penny, and it'll be right there. And for the average worker, this is a difference of, instead of earning $10,000 over the course of the growing season, which is about October through May, they're earning $17,000. So it's almost double. It's still poverty wages, but that's a major, major difference, just 1 penny a pound for tomatoes. So right now the pressure is on grocery stores. We've been taking rabbis and community members to the major grocery stores that we're pressuring to sign the agreement. The one that is probably most relevant for North Carolina is Kroger's, which I think we weren't really sure whether there's one nearby. I know there's maybe not. Okay, so maybe I'll say a few of the grocery stores because maybe in your hometowns where your families are. The other ones are Kroger's, Publix, which is mostly farther down south, though they're moving somewhere in North Carolina. I'm not sure where. Stop and Shop, Giant, and Safeway. Now, no grocery stores, other than Whole Foods and Trader Joe's, have actually signed the agreement, but you can't go after everybody at once. So even if you're going into a totally different grocery store, you can always just go in with a letter. You don't have to boycott. Just go into you can buy the tomatoes, go in with a letter, talk to the manager, and say, by the way, can you please ask company headquarters to buy better tomatoes, to tell your growers that they're not going to have a market for tomatoes that are grown under slave conditions. So just in the past year, there's been both the growers, as I said, have signed on to this agreement. There's an independent auditing organization headed by a retired New York State judge who's doing auditing of the tomatoes. And when we were down there, we met with this judge who's heading this organization, and she said to us, we're investigating a whole bunch of slavery cases in Florida. She said, we have a case in corn, and I forget what she named, a few other strawberries. She named a few other products. And she said, but over the course of the last year, we haven't seen anything in tomatoes. It actually seems that in a year, we've wiped out slavery in the tomato industry. So the goal now is to make sure that that's a permanent state. So I want to talk about what rabbis were doing there. Why would rabbis come down there? And I want to talk about that by talking about 3 areas in which I think that Judaism has a lot to teach us about how we relate to contemporary ethical and moral issues. The first area is that history is obligatory. In the Jewish narrative, the narrative starts with the Exodus from Egypt, the biblical story of slavery in Egypt and then liberation. In this story, of course, the Jewish people end up in Egypt. First, they're welcomed there as guests, they're living there, everything's peaceful, a new ruler comes along, and suddenly they find themselves in slavery, and then after many centuries are able to get out of slavery and to be liberated. Now, the interesting thing about that story is that almost exactly after the people get out of Egypt, when God starts giving them the rules that they're going to live by which they're going to create their society, God says, you have to take care of the orphan, the stranger, and the widow because you were slaves in the land of Egypt. Meaning that slavery in Egypt is not just a historical experience, but it actually dictates law in the present. And even actually later on, the Torah says very explicitly, don't hate the Egyptian because you were a sojourner there. So you might think you should hate the Egyptian because they enslaved you, but actually remember that, first of all, they welcomed you. And second of all, no matter what happened afterwards, there's a remaining obligation. Now, this is not intuitive. There's, of course, the classic paradigm of the neighborhood bully, which in the classic paradigm that's usually set up, this is a kid who doesn't get enough love at home, maybe there's some emotional abuse or physical abuse, comes to the playground and takes it out on everybody else. There's some psychological logic in that that's what would happen. But the Torah actually says the exact opposite. It says, no, because you experienced oppression, therefore you have a responsibility not to oppress other people. I grew up in Massachusetts, and we spent a lot of time studying about the Revolutionary War. And so we had to memorize all kinds of facts and figures and people and battles and et cetera, et cetera. I don't remember a single thing about it. But I'm pretty sure that in all of that time, none of my teachers ever said to me, because you as Americans are people who led a revolution, therefore you have to support other revolutionary movements. Nobody ever said that. Maybe that goes into a little bit of American foreign policy, but nobody ever said it so explicitly. Whereas growing up as a Jew, I heard over and over, because you experienced oppression in Egypt, you have a responsibility to other vulnerable and oppressed groups. So there's an idea in Judaism that history is obligatory, and I think that that's an idea that we can take into everything that we do when we think about our family histories, whether those are immigrant histories, histories of being workers, whatever kind of histories, to think it's not just something that happened in the past, but actually it imposes obligations for the future. So for us as rabbis, we got involved in the issue of tomatoes because we heard there was slavery, and we said, it's thousands of years after the Jewish people are supposed to have come out of Egypt. We sit around every Passover, we sit around our tables, our Seder tables, and we say, we used to be slaves, avadim hayinu, we used to be slaves, and now we're free. And how can we possibly say that when there's still about 21 million slaves in the world and thousands of slaves even in the United States, which officially outlawed slavery 150 years ago? So we said that history of slavery is obligatory. We can't sit around saying, we're so glad we're not slaves anymore, without also turning around and doing something about the fact that people still are slaves, even in this country, even in 2012. The second principle from Judaism is that you're allowed to get rich. There's nothing wrong with getting rich, but you can't do it on the backs of other people. Very often there's a contrast that's set up where some people will say, Judaism supports a laissez-faire economy. They point to certain principles, especially the idea that in workplace situations there's a concept of the minhag, or the custom of the land, meaning whatever the custom is, that's what you have to do. Whatever the custom is around pay, around treatment of workers, around working hours, that's what becomes obligatory. And some people will look at that and say, okay, well, the custom comes from the market. So if the market says you don't pay minimum wage, then you don't have to pay minimum wage. If the market says workers can't get breaks, you don't have to pay breaks. That's one end of things. The other end of things says, well, Judaism supports total socialism, a redistribution of income. And that model often looks at the Shemitah, or the sabbatical year. When debts are forgiven, debts are forgiven so that somebody who, let's say, owes $20,000 before the Shemitah year is down to zero, their debt gets canceled out, it's kind of a national bankruptcy, or people look to the Jubilee year, the 50th year, when land returns to its original owners. Now, as you might imagine, I don't actually like either of those explanations. I think the idea that Judaism says whatever the market produces is wrong, largely because the rabbis go to great lengths to make sure that they actually determine what the market says. They go to great lengths to say that the people of the town, or even the workers themselves, can set prices, can set working conditions, can make other conditions. And I don't like the idea that, I don't think that Judaism really says that there's a total redistribution, because even in the case of the sabbatical year, you don't take all the money and pass it out again. If somebody was negative $100,000 before the sabbatical year, now they're at zero. It's bankruptcy, which is way better than being negative anything, but they're still poor. Now maybe they have a chance because they're not in debt, but it's not like they got to get some of their neighbor's money. And with the Jubilee year, the land gets redistributed according to how it was originally, back when the land was first distributed in the Torah. But it doesn't mean that everybody gets their 1 acre or something of land. I should say that the Jubilee year is no longer operative. It's not clear whether it ever was, but it's a Torah law. So instead, I think that what Judaism supports is a controlled capitalism. And what that means is that people can earn as much money as they want, but there's specific limits on how they can treat the people who are helping them to make that money. So in the case of workers, for example, as I said, there is a concept that says that the custom or the minhag of the place determines what the law is, what you have to do. But then the rabbis of the Talmud, so 1,500 years ago, turn around and they say, okay, but the people in the townspeople can set working conditions. They open space for unions. They say the workers can get together and decide what the working conditions are. Later Jewish law makes it very, very clear that workers should, in fact, form unions, that unions are preferable, that unions are the way that workers are going to make sure that they protect themselves. There's a famous, actually twice in the Torah, it says that you have to pay your workers on time. Usually, in the Torah and early Jewish law, the low-wage worker is a day laborer. So it's somebody who's not paid by the hour like people are paid now, but they're paid by the day. So they work, let's say, 9 to 5 or whatever the hours are, and then they get paid for the whole day. They work the next day, they get paid for that day. And so the Torah law is that you're not allowed to keep the money overnight. When they finish their work at the end of the day, you have to pay them right then and there. One commentator, Rampant, Nachmanides, a medieval commentator, says about this, well, if you don't pay them at the end of the day, then they're going to go home and they and their families are going to starve. Now, this might be a little hyperbole, because everybody can go without eating for one day, certainly for one night. What I think he's saying there is the assumption is that these workers are poor, but at the very least, their day pay is enough for them to have a house, to have food for the day, to take care of their families, at least for that day. They're not getting rich. They still have to work the next day. They're living check to check, but at the very least, they have enough for the moment, which is, of course, very much in contrast to the United States, where even if you earn minimum wage working 40 hours a week, you're not coming anywhere near earning the poverty line, which is anyway artificially low. So this is the second thing that Judaism teaches, that it's okay to have capitalism, but you can't do it by oppressing other people, by oppressing your workers, by having your workers starve to death, by having your workers not be able to support themselves and their families. And this is, again, what we were seeing in the Florida tomato fields. We were seeing these major, major tomato companies earning millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars sometimes a year, and yet their workers weren't earning minimum wage. They were often being held in slavery, and their health was being compromised because of the pesticides they were working with. And the final principle from Judaism that I want to bring in is the idea that the money ultimately doesn't belong to us. This is a very difficult thing to understand, especially in America. We have this image that we work hard, the American dream, right? You work hard, you start your business, you work many, many hours, et cetera, you build yourself up, and you deserve whatever you get. Which is why we have such resistance, for example, to paying taxes, or such resistance often to people who need some help from the government. There's a line that gets repeated multiple times in the Torah where God says, Ki li haaretz, the land is mine. In other words, it's not yours. You can live here. You can be long-term sojourners here. But ultimately, nothing belongs to people, it belongs to God. There's a very common custom, in fact, of writing on books, especially on Jewish sacred books, and writing a biblical line that says that everything belongs to God, meaning that instead of just putting your name on the book as a way of saying, well, this is mine, this is from the library of Jill Jacobs, you put, I know that this book belongs to God, but here's my name in case anybody finds it and needs to know which shelf it belongs on. So there's an idea that everything ultimately belongs to God, and that especially comes up around the idea of tzedakah, of what's usually translated as charity, though that's perhaps not the most precise definition. The Jewish rules of tzedakah, of which I'll translate as gifts to the poor, are, first of all, that this money has to go to the poor. So tzedakah money is not money for the Metropolitan Museum. It's not money for building beautiful university buildings, sorry to those who do. It's money that has to benefit those in need, which can be defined in multiple ways. It can be very direct needs like housing. It could also be, let's say, financial aid scholarships, but money that benefits those who are in need. And the rule is that 10 to 20% of your income every year has to go to tzedakah. Now, the reason that I said this isn't charity is because charity implies that there is some altruism built in. It comes from caritas, of love. And tzedakah comes from the Hebrew word tzedek, or justice, meaning that it's the just thing to do to take 10 to 20% of what you earn and give it to somebody who's in need. It's not an option. So my husband and I would give away 10% of our income every year, at least. It leaves our bank account. We have our bank account set up so that it leaves our bank account directly. It just, every time we get a direct deposit, just 10% pops into a different bank account that's called tzedakah. We don't touch it, and psychologically, we don't feel like it belongs to us. It's not ours. It's in the tzedakah account. We can't go in there to pay for a vacation. We can't go in there to buy something from our home. It's in the tzedakah account. We only touch it when we're ready to give it out. And so the idea in Judaism is that this money it's not ours. It happened to land in our bank account, but it's our responsibility to figure out where it's supposed to go and get it out of our bank account and to the place where it's supposed to go. And I would say this relates to certainly a lot of the ways that we think about money and use money in the United States, both on a personal level and also on the level of state or federal dollars. But it also relates to how we think about companies and corporations, that we'll hear from corporations, well, I can't afford to pay my workers more. I can't afford to pay minimum wage. And part of our answer is, well, you're not allowed to get rich on the backs of other people. And part of our answer is, you got that money because other people worked for it. And so actually it's your responsibility to figure out how best to distribute it. Now, I bring up these three areas of where Judaism has something to say to contemporary American moral issues, because I think that it's crucially important that we bring religious principles into the public debate. And I say this knowing that not only, of course, is there an election in a couple of weeks, but it's a really big deal here because you all are in a swing state. It's funny, I've been listening to the radio for the last couple of days. In New York, you would not know there was an election if you didn't open the newspaper, because nobody is paying to run ads anywhere in New York. But here it seems like you probably can't turn on the TV or the radio for 2 seconds without hearing someone's ad. So the election is very much in the news. And every time there's an election in the news, religion is in the news, because you have certain candidates saying, well, my religious principles say that X, Y, or Z, and certain religious candidates saying their religious principles suggest something else, and certain people saying just keep religion out of it altogether. Now, I perhaps surprisingly believe that we have to bring religion into not only the election season, but into the public debate. But the way I wanted to bring it into the public debate is not the way that it often happens. Often you have one group of people saying, because of my religious principles, we need to pass this law. Often it's about restricting certain people's freedoms. And you have other people, mostly people on the left, saying, well, we don't want to talk about religion at all. Let's talk about bigger principles. Let's talk about social science. Let's talk about philosophy. Let's talk about democracy. And I actually think that's a wrong discussion. I think to have a robust public debate, what we need to be able to say is, okay, we need a lot of wisdom here. We need to learn from Judaism, from Christianity, from Islam, from every religion, and we need to learn from Locke and Rousseau, and from the principles of democracy, and we need to learn from philosophy, and we need to learn from social science, and we need to learn from people's lived experience. But let's have an actual conversation about how these different perspectives can help to guide policy. Not a conversation where one voice shuts down all the rest, but a conversation where we say, well, I have something to learn from you, I might not agree with you entirely, but I do have something to learn from your religion. I have something to learn from you. You have something to learn from me, and now let's bring it all together and have a real conversation about what sort of moral principles we're going to put into place in this country. There was a very common expression in the 19th century when the reform movement of Judaism first started in Germany, that it actually came originally from was written by a poet that said that you should be a Jew in the home and a man in the street. What it really meant was you should keep your Judaism at home, and in the street you should be German and modern and just a regular person. Now, that was in a very particular instance where the Jewish community was figuring out how to both live in modern society and also how to continue to be Jewish. I think we're past that. We're past it for Judaism, we're past it for Christianity, we're past it for Islam, for Buddhism. We're in a place in America where everybody can be very proud of who they are, what their religious tradition, their ethnic tradition is. We don't have to just hide it in our homes, in our synagogues, churches, mosques, etc. And I think there's actually a responsibility not just to be proud of our religious beliefs, but actually to bring them into the public square, to be a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim in the street, to say, I want to bring these religious views into the public debate, because I actually think that these thousands and thousands of years of religious wisdom have something to say to our moral challenges today. Thank you.